Greetings, good afternoon. Welcome to this wonderful afternoon. I am so moved and gratified to see so many people here in what appears to be standing room only as we mark the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in 1942, which resulted in the incarceration of 120,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent, two-thirds of whom were American citizens. I wish to acknowledge here, to my right, the presence of incarceration survivors and their family members who have been through so much, witnessed so much, and we must always remember what you went through. America may have been founded with some powerful and laudable democratic principles in mind, but many terrible things have been done in the name of America. And being here today is an opportunity for us to remember so that those things will never happen again. My name is Michele Storms. I'm the Deputy Director of the ACLU of Washington. We're one of the sponsors of today's event. I'm humbled to serve as your MC. The main organizer of this event is Densho, a Seattle-based nonprofit which celebrated its 20th anniversary just last year. They're dedicated to preserving Japanese American history, but also working to prevent persecution against other groups who are singled out based on race, religion, or national origin. Another partner in our event this afternoon is the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CAIR, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights organization. Their mission is to enhance the understanding of Islam, encourage dialogue, protect civil liberties, empower American Muslims, and build coalitions that promote justice and mutual understanding. And we also offer a special acknowledgement to the Seattle Public Library. Originally, this event was going to be hosted at the Seattle Public Library. As you can see, that wasn't going to work. They worked so patiently with Densho staff to relocate us to a larger venue, and they've been wonderfully supportive and accommodating. The incarceration of Japanese Americans is a historical tragedy and a stark lesson that our country should never single out any group of people and restrict their rights because of ethnicity, race, religion, or any other reason. But at this moment in time, we have a presidential administration that is doing just that with, among other things, recent executive orders that would have prevented people from 7 countries where people's primary practice of faith is Islam. These people's entry into this country under those orders would be barred, despite them having passed rigorous vetting, despite the absence of any indication that they are dangerous to the country. They were deemed dangerous specifically because of their faith, and that's the very thing we must guard against. Although we have numerous court orders now that have gotten in the way of those executive orders being held up, the risk is still real. We know that there are new travel bans proposed to be shared soon. We're fortunate in this state that our own state attorney general courageously and our, yes, yes. This is a proud moment to be a Washingtonian, right? It really is. Also, our Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project and our own ACLU of Washington have all been involved in filing cases to, yes. That being said, we have to remain vigilant. I feel that what we're seeing is a practice of othering, right? It's taking people for perceived differences and placing them in the out group, people that we're not going to treat the same as others. Whether they're Muslim or African American, Native or Indigenous, LGBTQ. We're subjecting people under this practice under less than human treatment. And those in power are using the fear of the other to divide us, just as they did back in 1942. We must not succumb to that. We have to ascribe to the opposite of othering, which is belonging. We have to acknowledge our shared humanity, care for each other, and take a stand for each other. So today, as we take time to remember those things which must never be forgotten, so that those tragedies will not be repeated. So let's begin our program. I'm really excited that the first person you're going to hear from is a young and powerful person, Troy Osaki. Troy Osaki is a Filipino-Japanese-American writer and performer. He's a Kundiman Fellow and a Youth Speaks Seattle alum and mentor. Between 2012 and 2015, Troy competed in national competitions such as Brave New Voices, the College Union's Poetry Slam Invitational, and the National Poetry Slam. He's now a full-time student in law school, and he also organizes with Anak Bayan, a comprehensive national democratic mass organization of Filipino youth and students in the US. Troy hopes to build a safe and just place to live by reimagining the world through poetry. Please join me in welcoming Troy.
All right, good afternoon, y'all. Could we snap for the organizers of today's events and for all of y'all for being here? Super amazing just to see so many folks and so much community in the room today. Again, my name is Troy Osaki. I am Filipino-Japanese American. I identify as Yonsei Gosei, so 4th, 5th generation Japanese American. Are there any Yonsei Gosei in the house? Okay, shout out to all the Yogos. So I am very honored to be here with y'all today in celebration of Japanese and Japanese American resilience, as well as to reflect on our unique roles as Japanese Americans in defending folks of Muslim faith as they are increasingly profiled and targeted by both state and interpersonal violence. I will be sharing a poem with y'all about reconnecting with my Japanese culture, and I'd like to offer it in solidarity with Muslim-identified people and with people who have ever felt like they've had to distance themselves from their culture in order to survive. So with that said, thank y'all again for having me. I hope you enjoy. Let's rock. My grandmother is the daughter of Japanese immigrants. In our culture, she is Nisei, 2nd generation Japanese American. When I visit her, she brings me to temple. Our ancestors' spirits gathered inside like a galloping dust storm. Their breath billowing above benches aligned in aisles like platoons of military barracks. When we chant, we recite in Japanese, a chorus of vocal cords trembling our native dialect in unison. And when I was young, I did not care to learn the language I descend from. Traditional practice was something I never thought to continue. I never once thanked my grandmother for the effort she made in teaching me how to read and write where I come from. Never asked the translation of my Japanese name. When I was young, I did not care how history dislocated my lineage for practicing their Buddhist tradition. On February 19th, 1942, Executive Order 9066 authorized the incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. My grandmother's family split apart as if their bodies were wood to be splintered like steam engine boats they traveled on to get here. Her father, a Buddhist priest, taught her to bow before an altar. Buddhist leaders were among the first to be imprisoned as if Pearl Harbor exploded from their prayer lines in their palms, palpitations propelling from their torsos like torpedoes. My grandmother was just another yellow-faced Jap, another kamikaze pilot, holstered with explosives, threats of suicide campaigns, another enemy spy. War hysteria was just another euphemism for scapegoat, as if evacuation was meant for her own protection. But guard towers were not safe when gooks and Orientals were lynched with barbed wire barricades at gunpoint. Every Sunday, she still attends morning service, glides her fingers against keys of an organ like a decomposing skeleton finding her flesh again. My grandmother never let her Buddhist tradition be constrained, even when caged in chain-linked fence. In our culture, I am Yonsei, fourth-generation Japanese American. And when I asked my grandmother the translation of my Japanese name, she told me, "Your name Susumu has been used by armies to attack. It means to move forward." Grandma, I'm sorry for ever feeling like I was too good to be Japanese. America has taught me to be less foreign, an unmarked atlas of where I am from, a Japanese accent pronounced like a small war in my mouth, conquered in English. I promise I will learn to read and write Japanese. Someday, I will thank you in our native dialect for never forgetting to move forward.
Thank you, Troy, for those beautiful and powerful words to remind us of how personal it is when these terrible things happen and how much it impacts not only the people it happens to, but the people who follow. Our next speaker is our mayor, Mayor Ed Murray. And Ed Murray became our mayor in January of 2014, promptly setting the tone for his administration by signing an executive order raising the minimum wage of city government employees to $15 an hour. And for this work, among many other things, he was named one of Politico magazine's 50 thinkers, doers, and dreamers who really matter in this age of gridlock and dysfunction. Since taking office, he has done so many important things, from piloting high-quality preschool programs, sustainable long-term funding for our parks, working with our bus service. He has many, many honors, including a Human Rights Campaign Leadership Award, an Anti-Defamation League Cal Anderson Award, Distinguished Public Service Award, Legislator of the Year Award, and a Warren G. Manuson Award. It's my pleasure to bring to the stage Ed Murray.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here today, and a special thank you to Densho for the work that you do every day. The term Densho means to pass to the next generation. And today, we are in a moment in this generation where the information that we need to pass is perhaps more significant than ever. It is a difficult period in our nation's history. It is a period where immigrants in this city and in this country are scared and confused. And today reminds us that we have been here before. We have been here before as a city. We have been here before at the end of the 19th century when Chinese Americans were expelled from the city of Seattle. We've been here before during internment when Japanese Americans were no longer to be found as farmers at Pike Place Market and when Japantown was emptied out. We've been here before in just recent years when anti-Semitism led to violence and deaths. We've been here before. And today marks not just a memorial about the past, but a message that we are never going there again. This city bears those scars. This country bears those scars. The history of what happened to the Japanese American community in this country goes back before internment. My grandparents immigrated here from Ireland at the turn of the century. My husband's, Michael's grandparents immigrated here at that same period of time from Japan. And while my grandparents would experience the anti-Catholicism of the 20th century, there was a difference. And this is what happens when you treat immigrants differently. My grandparents could become citizens. Michael's grandparents could not. My grandparents could vote, and Michael's grandparents could not. My grandparents could own property, and Michael's grandparents could not own their own laundry in Spokane. They had to put it in the name of their children. It wasn't until the late 1950s, after over a half a century of being here, that first generation of Shiozakis were allowed to become citizens and allowed to vote. We can never go there again. And the attempts to do that, the attempt to divide us, the attempt even to divide immigrant communities is happening particularly with Muslim Americans. It is one of the reasons why on Tuesday, the council and I will give the State of the City address, not at City Hall, but in a mosque. As we've gathered in African American churches at the height of the civil rights movement, so we will gather in this mosque because of how these buildings have been targeted, not just in this city, but throughout this country. Finally, in closing, we aren't going back. The name of the young poet we just heard about, he said, was forward. We as a city are going to move forward. And I have a proclamation that I will not read in full to you, but the proclamation from myself and the council declares today a day to remember Japanese internment in the city of Seattle. Thank you, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, it is so gratifying to have the kind of leadership in our community that really acknowledges that these issues are real and supports people of immigrant descent and all people. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, newly elected and the first Indian American woman in the House of Representatives. She represents Washington's 7th District, which is most of Seattle and several surrounding areas. I first came to know Congresswoman Jayapal when she was the executive director of what was then known as the Hate-Free Zone, now known as One America. She founded that organization following 9/11 and after the rise in discrimination and hate crimes against Muslims, Arabs, and Sikhs. And the organization, thanks to her, has grown to become a powerful organization focused on civil rights and building power in immigrant communities. But now on this national stage, she has brought her relentless, brilliant tenacity to probably the fight of her life. And she is dedicated to not only the issues such as minimum wage and racial equity and innovation, but really campaign finance reform, tax reform, voting rights, and an end to institutional racism. Let's get that. In all of these things, she'll continue to build the movement to expand our democracy and create the political space for policy change that benefits working families and responsible businesses. Congresswoman Jayapal.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Seattle. I am so proud to be representing so much of this city of Seattle and to be a resident of the city of Seattle. That turns out all of these people on the Day of Remembrance, thank you for being here. Give yourselves a round of applause. This is so beautiful. And I want to say thank you so much to Densho and my dear friend Tom Ikeda for your tremendous leadership over the last many decades, for the humanity, the compassion, and the recording of the stories from the past in such great detail, and the tying together of the links over the years from the internment to civil rights in this century after 9/11, all of the work you did. Thank you so much, Tom, for all of your dedication. And I also want to acknowledge our elders who have brought us to this place with your strength and your resilience and your courage. Thank you for being here and for continuing to represent the greatest parts of the United States. And to my dear friend Arsalan and to Michele Storms and the ACLU, aren't we lucky to have these incredible leaders and organizations here in Seattle? I like to say when I'm in Congress that Seattle is the moral conscience of the United States of America. And we are gathered together here because we know that when we say never again, we mean never again. As an organizer my whole life, I have always believed that telling our stories is an essential act of resistance. And the way that we organize and continue to fight for the things that we believe in is to tell the stories of the mistakes that we have made in the past, mistakes with enormous consequences for our country and for our world. And let's be very clear that Executive Order 9066 was a terrible, terrible mistake with enormous consequences for people in the United States and across the world, and we will never let that happen again. "75 years ago, when President Roosevelt signed that executive order, not too far from here, down at Seattle's King Street Station, Japanese porters disappeared. Japanese women working in our public schools were forced out of their jobs. And once President Roosevelt's order went into effect, they were rounded up along with 12,000 Japanese Americans in our own state by agents of our own government and then bused to internment camps. A woman named Toku Shimomura wrote in her diary, "It was time to leave Seattle, the city where we have lived for such a long time. Even though I tried not to cry, tears flowed." And it is with regret that I tell you now that that same heartbreak that Toku felt, that same deep feeling of separation, of being torn away from her community, the same flames of hysteria and racism that were being fanned back then, are what we are seeing again today, and it is why your presence here and your vigilance is so important. After September 11th, we experienced some of those same painful echoes of our history, and it's when I came to know Tom, when he reached out and said, let's make the connections between the Japanese internment and what is happening after 9/11. As many of you know, the Bush administration at the time passed the Patriot Act, went into rounding up Arab and Muslim men across the country, registered over 93,000 American Muslim men in special registration. And the same person that wrote that order of special registration is now back in the White House, Chris Kobach. We saw Somali grocery store owners living out the American dream right here in South Seattle, targeted by raids. And it was in that environment that I and so many of you came together to form Hate-Free Zone, then called Hate-Free Zone, now One America, to fight against that. And because of our collective action, we were able to sue the Bush administration and stop the deportations of 4,000 Somalis across the country. We were able eventually to end special registration. But part of what made that possible was the Japanese American community right here. And I still remember being with Diane Narasaki in the basement of ACRS for a meeting just a few weeks after 9/11, where we were talking about what was happening. And one of the most moving things to me was an elderly Nisei gentleman who stood up and said, if there's one thing that our legacy has shown us, it is that we can never allow this to happen again. And that Japanese American community has stood with us from that time to make the connections between civil liberties abuses in 1942, civil liberties abuses in 2001, and civil liberties abuses today. So thank you to the Japanese American community for continuing to lead on that. And we did, during the Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride in 2003, Mako Nakagawa, I don't know if she's here today, but Mako Nakagawa, a leader in the Japanese American community, we went to the internment camps in Idaho where she herself was interned. And we were able to continue to show how we must stand up together, that fear and patriotism together are very powerful means of suppressing dissent, but we must refuse to be afraid and we must refuse to be silenced, because our dissent is the most patriotic thing that we can do. To the concerned citizens and activists of today, whether you are protesting against an immigration detention center, providing sanctuary to immigrant families, or simply raising your voices and speaking out, as a member of Congress, I stand with you. We cannot let the abnormal be normalized, because this sets down the path towards repeating the most dark and terrible aspects of our history. Never again is now, and we need your voices as we move forward. And that is why, if you've been following my first very eventful 6 weeks in Congress, you know that I have fought tooth and nail for every person who has been threatened by this president's executive orders. And I will continue to do so. And I'm so proud that my first piece of legislation that I introduced last week, a bicameral piece of legislation with Senator Kamala Harris, she submitted it in the Senate. I ran it in the House. We worked very closely together, and it was the Access to Counsel Act, which essentially allows for all immigrants who are in detention of Customs and Border Protection or of ICE to have access to an attorney. How about that? Due process for everybody. Let me say, and I know many of you probably have many questions, and we too we watch every day unfold with a sense of horror and a sense of determination. And I can tell you that your voices have made a difference. Whether it was almost fighting the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary, and almost winning that battle, whether it was continuing to push for an investigation into our democracy and our election, or whether it has been to fight at the airport to stop a plane from taking off so that somebody doesn't get illegally deported. I have to say thank you for continuing to fight. Your voices are making a difference. And today, as we stand on this stage for this day of remembrance, I want you to know that it is only us that can make a difference. There is nobody else that is going to make the difference. And so when you wonder if your voices matter, When you wonder if your phone calls are important, and by the way, we've received over 14,000 phone calls, letters, and emails to our office. Thank you so much. When you are wondering if it matters, just know that if you do not stand up, then nobody else can stand up to form that collective voice. We need every single one of us in the struggle, and I look forward to talking about specific ways that we can continue to engage and fight for the values of this democracy that made my life possible as an immigrant to this country, and remind me all the time that I will never stop fighting for our city, our country, and our democracy. Thank you all so much.
So proud to have Congresswoman Jayapal as our representative. So proud. And so sure that good things are going to continue to happen. I'd like to now introduce Tom Ikeda, who is the founding executive director of Densho. He is Sansei, third-generation Japanese American, born and raised in Seattle. His parents and grandparents were incarcerated during World War II at Minidoka, Idaho. In addition to leading the organization over the last 20 years, Tom has conducted over 200 video-recorded oral history interviews with Japanese Americans, which is a powerful way to document and ensure that we don't ever forget. He has received numerous awards for his historical contributions, including the Humanities Washington Award and the National JACL Japanese American of the Biennium Award for Education and the Microsoft Alumni Fellows Award. He has been a huge moving force along with his staff at Densho to make this event come to fruition, and so please join me in welcoming him now.
Thank you, Michelle. Wow, so I'm walking up here. This is the first time I really got a chance to look at the audience here. To let you know, before the event, as people were streaming in, there was actually quite a few tears shed up front, amongst the elders and me, when we saw how many people were coming. I mean, thank you so much. This means a lot, because 75 years ago, when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, we didn't have this kind of support. No one came, or very few people came to support Japanese Americans right before they left. And so for us to do this event, so it would be like 75 years ago to have an event and to have an empty room, no one here. And so to have a room this large filled is meaningful, not so much to just remember what happened during World War II, but because we really want to support the Muslim community, because we know what happened. And so when we talk about Executive Order 9066, why is this important? I mean, the order led to the most extreme, largest violation of civil liberties in our country's history. 120,000 individuals, 2/3 U.S. citizens, were put in camps, no trials, no hearings. They were guilty of nothing. There were only two criteria that were used to put Japanese Americans in camps. One, were they of Japanese ancestry? And two, did they live on the West Coast? So you could be a U.S. citizen. You could actually be a veteran of the U.S. military. You could be an orphan, a baby in an orphanage, or an elder in a nursing home. It didn't matter. If you fit that criteria, you were put in one of these camps. And the disturbing thing to me is recently, more and more Americans think that that was right, that the current administration, including the president, have come out and said things like, to keep our country safe, we have to fear certain groups. And as part of that, he's talked about what happened to Japanese Americans as maybe, that's something that the country has to do. But they're missing a really important point. When we think about innocence or guilt, loyalty or disloyalty, we do it based on the individual. We don't do it based on race, religion, or things like that, based on group association. And so that's what we have to remember. And so we really got away from that with Japanese Americans during World War II. And so what I want to do today is spend a little bit of time to really break down what happened and how this happened to Japanese Americans, because there are so many parallels that are happening in our country today. And I'm going to do this. Pramila mentioned that I'm a public historian. I've been doing lots of oral histories. Something that I haven't done much in the past, but I'm starting to do now, is I'm actually starting to share my personal family story. And can we have the slides? And I'm going to start off with my grandfather. My grandfather came to Seattle in 1908, and he came to be a Japanese laborer. And the date is actually significant, because in 1908, there was a treaty made with Japan to actually ban the immigration of further Japanese immigrants to the United States. And so what I recognized that if my grandfather had come on maybe the next ship to the United States, he would have been denied entrance. And that just rings so much what's happening in our country today, where a person, if they're on a plane one day, the next day they may be denied entrance or sent back to the country that they're trying to come, even though they're coming legally. And so that was the beginnings of this otherizing of the Japanese community. And how did that happen? In the same way that we're being led to fear certain groups in our country today, that very much happened in the turn of the century. It was called the Yellow Peril, that Chinese and Japanese primarily were viewed as this dangerous force. They talked about it being a corrupting element in American society, and that if left unchecked, they would overrun the United States. But in that sort of hostile environment, my grandfather really wanted to live in America. And so he went back to Japan, married my grandmother, and then they came back to the United States. But even though they came back to the United States, it still continued and got darker and darker in terms of this yellow peril, that especially as Japan as a military force became stronger and stronger, calls in terms of Japanese being dangerous went over and over again. But the reality is that the Japanese story, the Japanese immigrant story in America, was just like any other immigrant story. We heard Mayor Murray talking about it over and over again, his Irish roots. And if you think about, and this is a photograph of my grandparents and their 6 children, the Japanese immigrant story was just like the other stories that we heard. They were thriving. It was in this environment that then World War II started, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Over 3,500 servicemen were wounded or killed. And the FBI immediately started picking up people. But here's something that I want to talk about in terms of terminology. Immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor is what we call the Japanese internment. And what happened was there are laws in place already that allow our government to pick up immigrants from a country that we're at war at. And so right away, several thousand men were picked up, but there were Japanese, Germans, and Italians. And so immigrants were targeted. In particular, most of them were Japanese immigrants that were picked up. And again, these laws were in place. What I now want to talk about is the expansion of our loss of civil liberties. And it started really with what I call the sort of the normalizing of extreme viewpoints. I talked about the yellow peril, and although that was sort of a drumbeat in our country, it was viewed pretty much as a fringe way of thinking in terms of the Japanese. But after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, what we saw was the mainstream media, in the fear and the hysteria of the war, now adopting the sort of sort of what I would call extreme viewpoints. I know it's hard to see in the back, but this is a political cartoon by Dr. Seuss. This was a cartoon that he did in a New York newspaper. And what he was portraying was now not just the Japanese military as being a menace, and going beyond the Japanese immigrants. It was now even targeting American citizens, that all of a sudden they were a threat. You know, Japanese Americans, Americans of Japanese ancestry. And so that led to what I call the incarceration. This is where 120,000 Japanese Americans, you know, again, based on their race and where they lived, were picked up, held in assembly centers, and then placed in 10 permanent camps. You know, as a side note, as this was happening on the West Coast, 150,000 Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not placed in these incarceration camps. The military commander there felt that Japanese Americans were loyal and they were needed for the labor force to get ready for the war. It was a military commander on the West Coast, General DeWitt, who believed that, essentially he had racist viewpoints of the Japanese and viewed that they were going to be an enemy race. And so that's why it happened just on the West Coast. So my grandparents and their children first went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. It was called Camp Harmony. And here's an image of what it looks like. And again, yeah, I heard a laughter. Yeah, the government used these euphemisms. They said that what they were doing was they were evacuating Japanese Americans for their safety to assembly centers and relocation centers, and called them things like Camp Harmony. From there, they went to a more permanent facility at the Minidoka concentration camp, Minidoka, Idaho. And it was here that, you know, going back to my family story, my uncle, the eldest son of the family, despite everything that happened to the family and other Japanese Americans, he decided to volunteer to fight for the U.S. Army in Europe. And he fought with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most highly decorated units in American military history. In fact, in the front row, we have Toshi Okamoto, who is a veteran of the 442nd. So thank you, Coach. And so here is a image of my uncles that volunteered. So he went to Europe, was fighting in Italy. And here are some numbers about the military service. I mean, over 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the U.S. military. And so this segment that Americans felt that were dangerous and suspicious, actually it was quite the opposite. They volunteered and fought in greater numbers than almost any other community in the United States. But while my uncle was fighting in Italy, he was killed in action with a German sniper bullet. And sort of the hard part in terms of our family history, the memorial service for my grandfather was held at Minidoka on this dusty field where hundreds, if not thousands, of people gathered to honor his life and service. And here's a picture of my grandparents. Here they are accepting the American flag. And you know, the hard part for me when I look at this photograph is, and what saddens me is that they never had the opportunity to accept that flag, you know, with the dignity of being in Seattle, in their homes, to accept this, that they had to accept this in a concentration camp in Idaho. And the point of the story and the takeaway is how a community, you know, decades before the incarceration, and having not only this injustice but this indignity set aside them, how it started so much earlier. It started with an immigration ban that was 30, 40 years before the incarceration. And so it's these little steps that happened, you know, to our community. And so that's why we want to have this event. You know, I wanted to share this because I think when people see this, when we break it down, you know, people start understanding what's happening in our country today. And it starts when, again, when we start looking at people not as individuals, but as part of a group that is potentially dangerous. And so this is a path, as other speakers have said, we can't let that happen again. And so again, thank you so much for being here. As a Japanese American, and I know people in this room share the same sentiment, we can never let this happen again. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom, for telling your very personal story and giving us some historical context to make sense of this. I'm happy to introduce our last speaker before our panel, and that is Arsalan Bukhari from the Executive Director of CAIR-Washington. It's a chapter of America's largest Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization. Mr. Bukhari himself was raised in a middle-class American Muslim household in North Seattle. He has a strong work ethic, values, faith, and sense of responsibility that come from his upbringing and practice of his faith, and as a member of a military family. So 2 of his uncles are proud U.S. Army veterans, formerly stationed in Fort Lewis and Fort Jackson, and his brother-in-law is a proud U.S. Navy veteran, formerly stationed in Naval Station in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In my work, I'm lucky to come across Arsalan Bukhari all the time, and he is consistently a calm and strong presence and advocate for equity and justice, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to him now. Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. And thank you so much to the Seattle Public Library, as well as for hosting us, and Representative Pramila Jayapal, Mayor Ed Murray, and our hero, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, who couldn't be here today, but inspires us every single day. You've probably heard a lot about American Muslims, but here's the reality that we know. According to every research survey known to mankind about American Muslims, they paint a picture of a community that is thriving, that is part of society, that's giving back to society every single day. The 2009 Gallup poll found that American Muslim women are the second highest educated religious group of women in the country. It also found that the income equality between Muslim women and Muslim men was nearly non-existent, and found that American Muslim women are as likely as American Muslim men to have a bachelor's degree or a higher education. It also found, great, thank you. It also found that American Muslims are by far the most racially diverse religious group in America. About 1/3 of the American Muslim community, 1/3 are South Asian, about 6% are Latino, and many other races that make the fabric of America. American Muslims have been part of society since our nation was founded. 1/3 of the slaves that were brought in to our nation's shores many years ago were Muslims at the time that they were brought in. A 2001 Harvard study also found that basically the more religious an American Muslim person is, and the more mosque going they are, the more likely they are to believe in basic American ideals, and the more likely they are to be involved in their local neighborhoods and in civic activities. And lastly, as I know from my own family and many others, including Purple Heart recipient Imam Benjamin Shabazz, who is here tonight, this afternoon, more than 10,000 American Muslims serve in our nation's armed forces currently, and many have made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation just in the last 15 years of combat. We also know from ISPU that 1 in every 18 medical doctors in the country is American Muslim, about 50,000 medical doctors who are American Muslims out of 914,000 practicing medical doctors across the country. So American Muslims really are part and parcel of our society, believe in the same values and freedoms that we all cherish, knowing that we are in this together. But the American public's view, we have seen, has dropped just in the past few years. This chart here shows that where we are here today has happened in recent years, not when you think it might have been instigated and well before when you might think it may have started. We have seen a drop in public's favorable views of American Muslims and an increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes. It didn't happen just by itself. We know that millions of dollars were spent on anti-Muslim hate groups like the Center for Security Policy and many more, who lobby Congress, state legislatures, Hollywood producers, media editors, and many others across the country, lobbying them to promote anti-Muslim hate. It didn't happen by magic. We have an opposition who's doing fantastic work, to their credit, to push decision makers to pass laws that have abridged the religious practice of American Muslims in many states. In the state of Tennessee, a law was proposed that would make the practice of Islam a felony punishable by more than 20 years in prison just a few years ago, well before this election ever started. We also know that just a few years ago, research showed that American Muslims and Islam were not only the most mentioned religion in primetime news, most of that coverage connected Islam and Muslims with negativity. In fact, it found that real-life, everyday portrayals of American Muslims made up 3% of the coverage of the religion that's most often mentioned in primetime news. We also saw entertainment media, shows like Homeland, 24, and many more films that reached millions of Americans across the country every week that portrayed American Muslims far removed from reality, the reality that I mentioned, and the reality that's found by every survey known to mankind about American Muslims. We also have research that showed that common anti-Muslim slurs, many of the words that you see here, appeared literally daily in mainstream media headlines across the country every single day, especially between the years 2007 and 2013. Words that are considered slurs by everyday families and children, and many words that basically are coded words to attack American Muslims. Words like this have been used for decades on anti-Muslim hate blogs, but they have recently started emerging in mainstream headlines. The same way that words that preceded a crime with a race, words like Islamic to precede a crime have been in mainstream headlines every single day. We also have research that tells us that the effect of those words on the lives and contributions of the children. There's research by the University of Hawaii, the University of Exeter, the National Hispanic Media Coalition that says that media content, not just in news media, but also in entertainment media, can have an effect on the public's perception of an American minority. And that is why, according to research, we are where we are today, because of the perception, not the actions on the ground. We also found that just last year, 50% of American or likely voters, 50% across party lines, when a presidential candidate proposed a ban, didn't just agree, they supported that ban. 50% of the public across party lines supported that ban. It is no wonder that after many, many years of consumption of those portrayals, that the average person would then be moved to support such a ban if they were moved to see an outstanding community group to be seen as somehow detrimental to the society, against all facts. We also saw that while no federal survey or department tracks discrimination against children in schools based on religion, community surveys found that 80% of American Muslim children reported being victims of taunting and harassment, oftentimes, in fact, many times, in front of their own teachers and administrators, and sometimes even at the hands of their own teachers and administrators. So what does that hate look like? You know, you see the stats there. 2015 was the year, not the years that you might think. 2015, very recently, was the year when we saw the highest number of anti-Muslim hate crimes reported in our nation's history. 1 to 2 daily reports reported to CAIR offices from some city in the nation, some CAIR office in the nation. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. It looks like a 19-year-old girl who was waiting at a bus stop in Everett when a man pulls up in the car, comes out of his car, grabs her from the headscarf, pulls her toward her with one hand, and starts punching her with the other hand, knocks her down, kicks her in the ribs with his knees, and leaving her with bruised ribs, lacerated cheek, and concussion to her head, and leaving her dizzy to come home to her mother, looking the way that she did. Imagine if your child or your daughter came home when she was hoping to go to work, looking that way simply because of the way she looked. And this young lady, I think, is here tonight as well. So that's just one example of the hundreds of attacks that we saw on Muslim children and women in most cases across the country in the year 2015 and the year 2016. These tragic events are all preventable. They're all preventable. In the year 2006 and 2015, as I mentioned, one more thing I want to mention actually is that between those years, we also saw a number of law-abiding American Muslims who were visited by FBI agents in their workplaces, in their homes, on the street. And not only were they questioned by FBI agents, many of them were blackmailed into becoming spies on their own community. And when some of them refused, they were threatened by being put on no-fly lists. Many of them were, all of them who reported these cases to her were U.S. citizens with clean records, nothing that would make them think about being visited by an FBI agent at their home in the workplace. And can you also imagine maybe a high-level technical person at a local IT firm having an agent coming into their office to interview them? How their career may be affected by it. Can you imagine a person who flies for business being put on a no-fly list? And how that would affect their careers, how that would affect their own families' lives and their own children's lives and their perception of their futures. That's the real-life effect of these policies and these perceptions that have been created. The good news is, again, as I mentioned, every one of us has the power to change that. Every one of us has the power to change and influence millions of hearts and minds across the country. Simple actions that you can take. You can send a simple email to letters@nytimes.com, letters@usatoday.com. Every one of you has a power to influence editors who are making decisions that tarnish the reputation, that malign the lives of children and families, and cause real physical harm to happen. Unintentionally, we believe, by the editors, but unintentionally does not mean that the real consequences don't manifest on these children's lives. You have the power to change their minds. And if every one of us, it'll take every one of us, if every one of us sends letters and emails to them, every time we see something that defames an entire community, we are able to change the way they describe Islam and Muslims. If every one of us also urges TV shows to have real-life depictions of American Muslims. That's, as I mentioned, the reality is known through research, but the perceptions that are created are so far removed from reality on top of being defamatory. And that's what needs to change also, is that every sitcom, every Hollywood movie should have a mainstream, realistic character so that millions of your fellow Americans get to see a real-life characterization of the Muslim persons that are their neighbors and that are their friends. As I mentioned, for decades, slurs have been used on anti-Muslim hate blogs by people who have the right to do it, but that have delivered real consequences on children's lives. But their power to influence people is no match for the style guides that have adopted those same slurs for use every single day in headlines. Words like the ones you see there, I won't say it, but it's there. And other words that have been used and have shown up in headlines every single day. This is what really causes that young person to be attacked in Everett, or for that lady to be shown a gun when she's waiting for her friend in a parking lot. These words and this context has real consequences for people's lives, and it has to stop now. And you have the power to make it happen by simply sending emails and using the power that you have in your pocket to influence millions of fellow Americans. So saying never again through action, followed by action, will result in never again. But I hope that you all exercise the power that you have in your hands by influencing millions. If you want to do it, you have the email addresses there. You can also sign up at our booth over there to sign up a letters to editors writing team or an article comments writing team, so that you can, again, use the power that you have in your pockets to influence millions. Can you imagine changing the hearts and minds of millions of Americans and really realizing that slogan of never again, really making it happen? We can all do it with the help of every one of your voices. Thank you.
There's nothing like getting practical, concrete information on what we can do to make a difference, and thank you so much for that. So we have one more thing we're going to do. We're actually going to have a panel discussion with Tom Ikeda, Congresswoman Jayapal, and Arsalan Bukhari, which I will moderate. And if you'll just give us a moment, we're going to get some chairs up here and rearrange the space a little bit. So hold on for that. We'll be right back. Okay. Yeah, no worries. Okay, thank you for your patience. We're ready to resume. And I want to tell you that you will have the opportunity to also ask questions of the panel. And if you would like to do that, there's a couple of ways that you can do it. There are people with Densho t-shirts that's black with the beautiful white spiral logo on it who will have note cards available for you. But also if you want to ask your questions via Twitter or Facebook, you can use the hashtag #NeverAgainIsNow, and someone will be picking up on those too and then bringing those questions up to me. So I know we've already welcomed these folks before, but they're so wonderful. Let's welcome them again. So something that I was thinking about, even before the election, when then candidate Trump was saying that he wanted to have a ban against Muslims entering the country, he talked about religious vetting. Those things were really chilling to me when I heard them, and I felt like there wasn't that much of an outcry in the public space. And now, and part of what was so chilling to me was because of this connection to Japanese incarceration and even to the Jewish Holocaust, right? And so now that he is president, some of those things have been coming into fruition with lightning speed. And I keep thinking to myself, where is, now not counting the people here, obviously, who get it and who care, I find myself wondering what is happening with the public. Are people in denial? Do they not get it? Do you have any thoughts about that? Any of you?
Michelle, I'll start. I think that was the goal of this this event. It's education. I mean, I think Arsalan did it well in terms of this PR effort to portray a group as being dangerous. I think it's very intentional and manufactured. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, I think one way we can fight back is with good information, both historical and current information. So I think that's one way of really fighting back.
Thank you. Go ahead.
A couple things. One, I was just saying to Tom that, even after 9/11, we didn't have a room, anything like this. In fact, it took quite a bit even to get some of our elected officials to stand up against what was happening post 9/11, because people are always afraid to be seen as somehow endorsing terrorist actions or people that are engaged in terrorist actions. And that's a huge problem, because there is so much, as Arsalan said, that is in the media that tries to connect, for example, Muslims with terrorism. And so that is something that I think we still have to work on. And I'll give you one small example. Arsalan mentioned the no-fly list. All of us are against gun violence. We're all for responsible gun legislation. But I have to say the legislation around no-fly, no-buy is problematic because there are so many problems with the no-fly list. So I think there's a lot of work that we have to do to help people understand what's wrong with some of these things that are out there and why the no-fly list is a problem. Because when you hear it on the surface, it sounds like that's a good idea. If somebody's not allowed to fly, they shouldn't be able to buy a gun. But what people don't understand is so many people, we fought for so long, for so many years after 9/11, to try to get people off of the no-fly list because they shouldn't have been on there to start with. So I do think that we're seeing, just like this, we are seeing an unprecedented level of engagement. And a gentleman was talking to me right before the panel started and said, we're moving from consumers to citizens. I hope I got that quote right. And that is, I think, true. People are realizing that you cannot sit back, whether it's seeing a term that's biased in the media and responding with a letter to the editor, or whether it's calling your congressperson or your, whoever it is. It's very important. But don't forget that this movement it takes work to continue to build it. And we have had to build it over the years with the work that different people have done in the audience, to the point where it is okay for our Attorney General to come out and file the nationwide class action lawsuit, or for Seattle to be a sanctuary city. That started way back when. So our work today is not only helping us in the moment, but also preparing us for the future.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just add what Representative Jayapal mentioned. A lot of lawmakers are hesitant to step forward, and that is why it is up to every single one of us. It takes hundreds and hundreds of us. We have 1,200 people here tonight. If out of all of us, a few hundred wrote an email to an editor, many, many, many of us will get published. Lawmakers will read it, and they'll find it to be politically safe to then speak out and repeat that same message that needs to be heard by fellow Americans so importantly. So it is, again, up to us to start that conversation and to start that public push. Lawmakers often do wait for their perception of public sentiment to change. It is up to us, and we have the power to change that public sentiment by simply sending simple emails using the power that we have in our pockets and our cell phones. So we can all do it together, and we should all start today.
And just one other comment before we move on.
Sure.
Yeah, the power of story, too. You heard stories today. And for each of us to just share with 5 others. I mean, I think we had 1,200 seats, but I think there are probably about 1,500 people here. It's a ripple effect. And again, that's, going back to what both, Congresswoman Jayapal and Arsalan said. I mean, Seattle's a special place because I think we had this in place and we've been sharing it for years and years. But we need to continue it. We need to expand it beyond Seattle.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think some of you talked a little bit about how there's a divide and conquer tactic, right? And not only to pit immigrant communities against each other, but even just all of us as human beings. And any thoughts you have on how we can fight against that divide and conquer mentality?
Sure. I think, well, Seattle has really set the tone for the rest of the country. Not saying that Seattle is better than the rest of the country. I'm just biased because I love Seattle.
It is.
But,
it is.
Being together as a community is very contagious. If we can do it here and really make sure that that carries over the airwaves to the rest of the country, we can really set the example. And I think we see successes. Every time we coalesce and work together, we win. And every time we don't, well, we almost win or not quite win. But every time we do coalesce, we win. No matter what the issue is, we've seen that over and over again through history and through recent history. We have seen here in response to, for example, this issue at the airport. If you're there that night, the day after the executive order was passed, you'll see people of all stripes, of all backgrounds at the airports in very large numbers. And that happened across the country. And you saw how that immediately sent a strong message to the federal level lawmakers and locals. Again, Attorney General Ferguson is our hero. He's a champion. But he was encouraged by you. He saw you on TV. And he was then further encouraged to then take the action he did. So again, it takes all of us to encourage our leaders to take action. And we really modeled what it means to be one community coming together when things happen.
So I was at the airport. I think I got there at about 1 o'clock and was there until, for 8 or 9 hours. And I also just want to call out the ACLU, the attorneys at
Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project?
I was going to say Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, but McDonald Hogan Bayless,
Yes,
McDonald Hogan Bayless, who were right there. And people don't know this, but at the same time that the nationwide stay came down from New York, from the judge in New York, we also had our own temporary restraining order that was on behalf of the 2 people that were on the plane that were about to be deported. And so that was really thanks to the attorneys here who made that happen, and a number of things that were sort of put into place as that situation unfolded. And Arsalan's absolutely right that having thousands of people at airports across the country mattered. And it mattered that they weren't just Muslims who were directly affected. It mattered that there were Caucasian Americans and Asian Pacific Americans and African Americans and so many others who were there saying, an injury to one is an injury to all of us. If you take away civil liberties of one group, you take away civil liberties of all groups. And so that goes to your question, Michele, which I think we have to continue to draw the connections between self-interest and collective interest, between the eroding of rights for some and the eroding of rights for all. Because the idea is that we can be divided and conquered is based on the notion that we are going to care more about ourselves and our own safety than we are about collective security and safety that preserves rights for all of us. So I just hope that as we tell our stories that we do what our Japanese American elders did in connecting 1942 to 2001 to today, because it really is important that people understand that it matters for me. You know, after 9/11, people used to say, but why are you standing up for, are you Sikh American? Why are you standing up for Sikhs? I said, no. They said, are you Muslim American? I said, no. They said, are you Arab American? I said, no. And people would say, well, why are you standing up for all these people and taking all these risks and getting death threats? It's because this is our community, and our policing of the ability to preserve rights for everybody is what ensures that we continue to have a democracy that speaks for everyone.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a sort of a historical sort of precedent for this. You know, Pramila, as you were talking, you know, I thought about, you know, we call them the Gang of Four. You know, Bob Santos, who passed away, is it, I guess, last year, Bernie Whitebear, Roberto Maestas, and Larry Gossett. So you had representatives from the Asian American community, the American Indian, the African American, and the Latino community. And these four men were incredible friends at first. I mean, and there was such a fondness for each other. But they brought their communities and so that they would understand what's happening in each of our communities. So we got out of our silos, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, which was so important, I think, in terms of, again, the fabric of Seattle and why we can do the things we're doing. It, you know, as I you know, just think about what we're talking about, you know, these coalitions just don't happen overnight. I mean, there has to be this level of trust that builds up. And, you know, in Arsalan, I feel like we're doing this in our work, and that can grow. But we have to not only, you know, connect, but then be very public with it. And I think that's what the Gang of Four did so well. So I think we can learn a lot from that.
Thank you. Have a couple audience questions starting to come through. So one of them is, what are the chances of a Muslim ban? And I don't know if Congress.
Let me take that.
Yeah.
So as
Yeah, that's what I thought.
as you know, Donald Trump has, I just can't say President and Trump together, but Donald Trump has said that he is no longer going to challenge the case that Attorney General Ferguson put forward all the way up to the Supreme Court. What he's doing is recrafting the executive order to be more targeted. And frankly, that is deeply concerning to me because he can do that. And there are many things within the executive order that were not challenged by what the court said. And so it is possible for him to achieve almost the same effect of the Muslim ban without calling it a Muslim ban or having it implemented in exactly the same way. So this is not over, and we are going to have to really continue to keep up the resistance, even if a court is not going to declare it unconstitutional. And I worry, of course, we're going to have all the challenges, and the ACLU is ready. So many other organizations are ready for that. But it is possible for many things to happen. And as Tom said, you saw it in 1942, where there were things that happened that were legally being done. And so particularly because of the national security exemptions to just about every constitutional right and every, I mean, there are remarkable exemptions in the name of national security that would allow for people to be classified as national security threats. And you see it in the other immigration executive orders as well, that if somebody is just suspected of a crime, or charged with a crime but not convicted, has never been through the courts, then those people are allowed to be rounded up and deported according to these executive orders that are coming through. So we have to, I think, be very, very careful to not assume that because the Muslim ban as it was crafted is no longer deemed constitutional, that they're still not going to be able to do some of these things. And it's why the resistance that has started is so important to continue.
Thank you very much. So another comment that came from the audience is that living in Seattle, we can tend to be in a bubble, and that the biggest impact in this election cycle was made from rural America. So the question is, how can this message and education that we're experiencing in this room today get spread to where it matters the most? And what things can we do to bring that out beyond this community?
Yeah, that's really the key question. Arsalan and I were just talking about it. I mean, how do we get beyond Seattle? I think part of it is, in Arsalan we're talking, really taking things like this on the road. I mean, actually going to other parts of the country and sharing the Japanese American story, what happened and what's happening to Muslims. And to do it face to face. I mean, I worked at Microsoft and I love online stuff, but there's so much that gets lost when you do it online. I think the face to face, where we can have forums like this, where we can actually talk face to face, I think that begins to make a difference, because then I think they see Asians, Muslims as people and not as these stereotypes. So I think that's really critical.
That's wonderful.
So I've got a couple things for you, as you might imagine. How many people have family members in states or districts that are not held by Democratic lawmakers who are already with us? Raise your hand if you've got any family members. Just look at this. Now, if each of you were to take 5, okay, start with 3 if you really can't get to 5, of your family members, people that you work with, people that you've kept politics away from because it's challenging to talk about it at the dinner table, or it's challenging to talk about in the office. If each of you were to take 3 to 5 people and start there with talking about these issues, what you've heard, and yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, but democracy is not a comfortable sport. And if we are going to prevent what happened in 1942, what's happened in the Holocaust, what's happened in other places to happen, stop that from happening today, we're each going to have to be a little uncomfortable. And so I am doing that with my Republican colleagues.
Bless you.
I have gone on, as you know, since 9/11, I've been on Lou Dobbs, Bill O'Reilly. I've been on all the conservative talk shows. I'm doing that still. I've been talking to Trump voters on a show called Indivisible. I did it a couple weeks ago on NPR, because I think it's important to engage with people and to do it with love and compassion and generosity, but to be clear about what it means if they do not speak out against what is going on today.
So this one is specifically for Mr. Ikeda, about Japanese Americans incarcerated in Hawaii. And so we have an audience member who did have a family member there who was, so that there were some members of the community, and just kind of wanted to bring that up, that there were some families also torn apart in Hawaii.
Yeah, so if you think back to my talk, right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the FBI picked up primarily men who were Japanese nationals immediately, and that happened both on the mainland and in Hawaii. And so for those who were in Hawaii, generally they're talking about that experience. That next phase where U.S. citizens were picked up and put in camps, that didn't happen in Hawaii. So in Hawaii, we're talking on the order of about, it was between 1,000 to 2,000 that were picked up versus 120,000 on
Right.
the West Coast.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, no doubt about it, anybody who got picked up, that was suffering, right? So thank you for pointing that out. Here's a question about solidarity efforts for LGBTQ asylum seekers from the 7 banned countries, and if there's any work being done in that direction.
There's a number of letters, and I'm a proud member of the LGBT caucus in Congress, and it's a growing and wonderful caucus. So we are continuing to. There are a number of letters around LGBTQ equality in the face of all of the immigration executive orders, including the Muslim ban and the interior enforcement and the border wall enforcement. But I would say that, again, the really important thing here is to point out all of the different communities that are affected, but always make sure you're linking to the broader group of people that are also being affected. And so that's what we're trying to do, is make sure we have stories of LGBTQ communities who are community members who are affected, so that we can join that into the mix, and the supporters of LGBTQ equality can also then be supporters of Muslim rights equality and immigrant rights equality and vice versa. So please continue to bring those stories forward so that we understand together how our communities are linked.
I think that really goes to the conversation about not dividing and conquering. Right now, anybody who's being otherized or who is in a marginalized group is at risk, and if we don't stand together, we're not going to win, right? I think that's been said earlier. For Arsalan, a couple of things. One, if you could say more about slur words, and some were obvious, but others were surprising, and how to root that out. And then also I want to add to that the idea of how can we get to know more of our Muslim neighbors and brothers and sisters if we don't necessarily have access. How can we learn more? So both of those things, if you will.
Sure, thanks for asking. So, so some of the words they said were obvious, others were not, and they mentioned the T word. I won't say, but I'll spell it Terrorist. It's that bad.
I don't like to say it either.
So that word is we did analysis of the Seattle Times coverage just to kind of see, get a sample of how are certain words and phrases and how is the Muslim community being portrayed. Not because the Seattle Times stands out in some way, it's just our local paper. What we found is, and it's a reflection of the national scene, because almost all the stories we found were reprints from national media. That's why we're asking you to write to national media, who originate most of the stories. We found that not only does the T word have no one definition among law enforcement agencies, the NSA has their own, the FBI has their own, the NCTC has their own, DHS, Seattle Police Department, State Patrol, and others. They all have their own definitions. They're very open also. So they're open to prosecutorial discretion as well, but they're all different. In media use, or at least in our research, we found that it was almost always used to describe a Muslim person or group, almost always. We looked at the story of the Norway person you might have heard about many years ago. That word was never once used in a headline to describe that person's actions, never once used to describe in the years-long research that we did to describe the person in Arizona who shot a sitting congressperson, almost killed her, and killed many other persons. Not once in any story was that word used, and many more examples. But it was used consistently in headlines. As I mentioned, these words appear daily in headlines in mainstream media. Again, not far left, not far right, mainstream media. Every single day to describe almost always Muslim persons, while there exists no one definition that is agreed upon by all law enforcement agencies. And that's what we find problematic. It's a loaded term, really means Muslim person, really. And that is what we hear on the ground when young women, like the one in Everett was called that word. Many hate crime victims hear that word as they're being beaten or shot or otherwise attacked. So it really does, again, result in people internalizing those terms and imagining their neighbor, their coworker, a girl standing at the bus stop to be what that word means to them. That's why it's so dangerous.
Thank you very much. Because you just mentioned, again, the young woman and what she experienced, I wanted to approach this. I think that there's nobody sitting here behind this table who hasn't had some experience with derogatory comment or activity. And when I think about that young woman, my heart goes out to her. And I wonder what suggestions you all have for us in our daily lives when we see things like this happening, because it's happening with alarming frequency. And it's hard for me to believe that when that woman was being beaten that there was nobody anywhere nearby. And so what are things that we can all think about, ways that we can respond when we see something like this taking place?
Well, I was thinking about this because I've heard so many incredible stories of people standing up in those moments. A couple that I know very well, the husband was at a bus stop and somebody started abusing this Muslim woman, and he actually put his body between that person and the woman and physically blocked the way. And I was thinking about all the marches we've done over time, and you know how we have the peacekeeping forces that are always ready to hold link arms and make sure that they're sort of providing that space. And what if we really tried to think about our physical presence in that way in every moment of the day? So if you do see something like that happening, of course, immediately call 911, try to videotape or take pictures of what's going on, because hate crimes are so difficult to prove because there's often nobody around. So it's very difficult to get something classified as a hate crime legally. But to really think of your own physical presence to the extent that you're not afraid, and you should not put yourself in harm's way, but if you were able to get other people and really create a physical space of safety, put hate-free zone signs on and UFCW produced some beautiful Washington hate-free zone signs for us back in December when we did that press conference. You can get them from UFCW, or we'll try to get them in our office so you can come by and pick them up in our office. But put those signs up, have physical displays that show which side you're on, what you stand for. Wear a button. You know, the Sikh community was so misunderstood for their turbans after 9/11, and people don't know this, but the reason that they originally started wearing turbans was because it identified them as a person who would defend anybody's right to be safe and protected. That's where the turban in Sikhism came from. So it's important, I think, to have some physical reminders that you are a warrior for justice, and that if somebody is in trouble, that you're ready to stand up with them, and obviously always taking care of yourself and always calling on 911 and others, but really creating that physical space.
Thank you.
You know, and to build upon what Congresswoman Jayapal also said is, and each of us just almost, I mean, it's unfortunate to have to say this, but to anticipate that may be sort of in your future pretty soon, that you will see these things. And I know for me, just thinking about that and thinking about, so what am I going to do? I mean, really walk through those steps. And there are trainings in terms of upstander trainings, how to prevent the bullying, things like that. And I think it's worth thinking about that and actually doing those things, because if you do see it, if you're not prepared for it, it's so easy to just get paralyzed and just watch it happen. So I really encourage everyone in the room to think about what you're going to do when you see it next. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to recommend a resource. So teachtolerance.org has an amazing downloadable booklet that talks about how to respond to problematic speech, whether it's within your family, in your workplace, or on the street. It has lots of different sort of hypothetical situations that are real situations, and gives you suggestions to walk through. And so I would just recommend people take a look at that, because it's an amazing resource, and it helps, as Tom said, to think ahead, what will I do? And I also think, given that Congresswoman Jayapal has suggested that we talk to our family members, there's some good hints for, at the Thanksgiving table as well. So.
Can I mention one other thing, Michelle,
Absolutely.
too? Just a plug for something that we did many years ago with CAIR and with the Sikh Coalition at One America. It was a Justice for All curriculum, and there are booklets that have educational information on the Muslim community and on Islam, on the Sikh community, on the Arab American community. And then for those of you that are teachers, there's actually, it was designed by a Harvard-educated, professor who created sections that you can use in your classrooms that link 1942, 2001. I mean, this is obviously done in 2005 or 2006, but it should be on the We Are America website, or you can email them and get a copy of it. We'd love for you all to use it. It's relevant all over again.
Thank you. So I realize that it's actually now 3:30, and that happened really fast. It wasn't possible to get to all the questions that were submitted, so I apologize for that. I think just before I close out the event, if there's anything that each of the three of you would like to convey along these lines of how we ensure that never again is now, I would welcome those observations.
So I'll start, and it was sort of when I thanked everyone for being here. Please realize that to really make change and to really never have this happen again, it's not people who speak out on panels. It really is each of you making a difference. That's what makes Seattle special. I think when Pramila said, our leaders are able to do things because they have the support of the people. And so please know that it's you that's going to make the difference, and that's my takeaway.
I totally agree with that, and I did want to say that one of the things that's happening now that's challenging is that there are so many things coming at us every single day. And I know that sometimes it feels like you just want to you don't want to engage with it, and there may be days when you have to take a break, but I want to urge you to not get yourself into the space where you disengage because it's too much, because we really need you. And we actually do need you on all of these things, because if our president is undermining the press, the free press, that is a terribly disturbing symptom of, and one that we've seen happen over and over again in terrible situations, from the Holocaust to the internment to post 9/11. And so we have to make sure that we are speaking out on all these things, even if it sometimes feels challenging. And I've told some people what you can do is have a group of 10 or 20 or 30 people, and if you need to take a break, say to somebody else, okay, can you get another 10 people to engage for the next 24 hours, because I got to have a break. There are ways to take care of yourself, but also to make sure that you are continuing to speak out. And then I did want to just also say that we are going to be doing our first town hall on March 6th at Town Hall Seattle in the main room, because we know there's going to be a lot of you that show up. And I think it's at 5:30. So we just finalized all the details. So please come out, because there are a lot of issues that we need to talk about, what we're talking about today, but also really all of the ways in which your voices are so critical for preserving our democracy and the promise of who we are as a country. Thank you all so much for being here.
I would just echo the same things. The power really is in each one of your hands. Lawmakers, imagine if on the night that thousands of people came to the airport, if it was just us and a few other suits and ties, what sort of an impact would that have made on people across the country? But no, it was every person who cared, who came out and stayed there for a while and made that impact, right? So every single one of you counts, and every single one of you has that power, as I mentioned, using your email box, sending emails to letters at nytimes.com, at usatoday.com, and make sure you do that to tell the stories of American Muslims or what you learned today. It's as simple as that, sharing that with people beyond your bubble. And I hope you've learned that lesson about the bubble, right? So we've got to reach people in Middle America, in Eastern Washington, in Seattle, Washington, with the power of our pen, with the power of what we know, to help them understand their Muslim neighbor and help them understand our basic American values, which need to be reminded of. And again, urging fair-minded leaders, fair-minded style guide writers at the Associated Press to be accurate in their language, because that really does result in real physical consequences of everyday American Muslim women and children. And then again, signing up at our booth over there to join a list, if you please, to send letters to these national editors, and also to comment on article comment boards, again, to reach millions and millions of people far beyond our own social circles. That is how we're going to make change. To learn more, I wanted to also mention there's a lot of things that I mentioned that are far removed from reality that are being said about American Muslims. There's a website called Islam Fact Check, islamfactcheck.org, and that has verifiable facts that I mentioned a lot of these stats and figures. That has links to source data for all the research that we have access to about American Muslims on islamfactcheck.org. That's an example of something you can share, again, with millions of fellow Americans by simply emailing that to national editors. And then there's also a website called CAIR Seattle, our own website, CAIR-Seattle.org, CAIR-Seattle.org/allies. And that has specific concrete ideas about what actions you can take to be a public and vocal ally. Chief among them is to use the power of the pen, the power that you have in your own pockets, to educate millions beyond our own circles. And I hope you start today by doing that.
So earlier I spoke about belongingness as being part of the antidote to the divide and conquer and to the fear that is in our presence. And I think one of my commitments that I continually remind myself of and ask us to think about is how we continue to embrace, all of us as members of the human family, and to stand up for other people, to find a way to share our stories, find a way to learn more, to keep history in mind so that we don't repeat it. And really to speak out against injustice when we see it, whether it's letting media outlets know that we don't appreciate the way that they're characterizing members of our community, or that we letting our elected officials know, either by showing up at the airport or by writing them letters and emails to let them know what we will not tolerate going forward. These are the things, some of the things that we can do to make a difference. If I could just tell you a couple quick things for you to know, many of you probably already figured out that there's a number of tables in the back here where you can learn more about all of these issues. And also Elliott Bay Bookstore has some wonderful titles on the issues we've been talking about, and they're donating 10% of their proceeds tonight to Densho in honor of this 75th Day of Remembrance. And I want any members of the media to know, if they were hoping for the opportunity to speak with any of the incarceration survivors or their families, or members of the Muslim community who are here and happy to speak with you, again, look for those folks with the Densho t-shirts on, and they will help you to get connected. I also want you to know that Densho volunteer Barbara Yasui is in the back with a banner that people can sign to show their support for the Muslim community. It's something that's going to be used in marches and other public events, of which there will be many. So please come up and sign that. And then I guess finally, thank you so much for being here. Again, my heart is just overwhelmed to see this room full of people showing their support, showing their solidarity, that what we remember will never happen again. And as you leave, oh, so I already said that. So anyway, so just, so thank you for being here. And I want to ask one last time for your gratitude for Densho, for CAIR Seattle, for the Seattle Public Library, for all those who work to make this event happen, and for our brilliant panelists and speakers who we've heard from tonight. Thank you very much.